Welcome to Fresh Economic Thinking. This week, a very special guest, Mark Changizi, all the way from Florida, one of my Twitter idols who has a very rigorous scientific mind. And I thought all year, last year, who should I get on the podcast in 2026? And Mark was the first to come to mind. So welcome, Mark, to Fresh Economic Thinking.
Oh, great to be here.
So I first found you, I think during COVID, you were very outspoken, and I do want to get onto that and sort of tell the story of your views about freedom of expression. But I wanted to ask a simple story for the audience to maybe get acquainted with you. Why do people's fingertips get pruny when they're wet?
Yeah, this goes back 16, 17 years. So, the standard explanation that everybody knows is you stick them in water and there's some kind of osmosis, and you kind of wave your hands and you say, well, they become wrinkly because of osmosis. And it never even makes sense on its own terms, because if you were absorbing water, then what happens is it becomes less wrinkly. That's what happens if you absorb water. Things swell and they lose their wrinkles. And so it doesn't really make sense even on its own merits. But I was looking, I study a lot of morphology and why and design questions about why we evolved to be the way that we are. And I was looking at why the hand is structured like it. I was trying to come up with some grand unifying theory of that. Never came of it, anything of it. But I found some studies from the 1920s or 30s. These are emergency room doctors, and they had noticed that if a patient came in a car accident and there was a nerve cut, and you were unsure whether you're not sure if there's a nerve cut or not. So the question is, how can you tell the patient's unconscious or non-responsive? But it turned out that they figured out somehow that if you stick their finger in warm water, if there's a nerve cut, you won't wrinkle. And so this has been known for 100 years, or 80 years, and yet sitting in all of the mythology and the memes across human society has been this osmosis story, in spite of this published stuff and obscure journals from the 1930s. But this undermines that account entirely, because if it was osmosis, some automatic side effect of water absorption, you should see that irrespective of whether there's nerve damage. So the fact that it relies on nerve damage starts to suggest that, well, maybe there's a good reason for it. Maybe it's on purpose. And so a student named Roman Weber and I started to ponder what could be the reason for why we would want wrinkly fingers. And then it occurred to us, well, rain treads. So, if you're a race car under normal conditions out on the track, you don't want treads. Treads just means less traction with the ground. You want to have treads only if it's raining. So the question is, okay, we have treads and they come out when it's raining. That is, we have these wrinkles that come out when they're raining. Could it be that they're designed to be rain treads when it's rainy and dewy? And so then you can work out, you can say, okay, what should they look like? What should, in fact, the shape of the treads be if they really are treads of design to channel out water when you squeeze, so that they optimally and most efficiently squirt the water out? And you can derive that. And in fact, that's exactly the kind of, in fact, they have the kind of channel shapes that you find in mountains and drainage networks on mountain or promontories. Drainage networks on flat areas are always just like trees. They eventually just keep, creeks go into bigger creeks, which go into streams, which go into rivers. But on mountains, they actually are the other way around. The thing that's tree-like is actually the divides. And so, there's a whole kind of talk that I could give, and I have given. There's a TED talk or TED cartoon on this. But it turns out it has exactly the kind of topological structure that promontories or mountains have, and you end up with exactly the kind of drainage networks that you would expect for that kind of topography.
So thank you for that intro. I'm sure you've told that story 1,000 times. I've probably told it 100 times, because once I sort of got onto your work and started reading about, color vision and eye location and all that sort of stuff, it really tickled my fancy. I'm a very big proponent that evolution does things that are favorable to survival. So let's get back to you, Mark. I've read your CV, I've read a couple of your books and seen your TED Talks. You were a mathematics research. You have a PhD in maths and physics, is that right? How did you end up in this field of what is like, what do you call your field now? It's like an evolutionary,
Yeah, I mean, kind of like an
yeah, tell me.
evolutionary neurobiologist or evolutionary biologist, but really, I'm a cognitive scientist. But if I look back at my high school essay, to college, it was something about trying to understand consciousness and the complexities of life and all of these deep kinds of questions that are really fundamental. But I said, I'm not going to do any of that first. I'm going to go do physics and math and computer science and all of these hard, rigorous stuff, because my feeling at the time was I needed to know all that stuff to be rigorous enough to theoretically address a lot of those sorts of questions, which I did end up addressing. So undergrad was physics, math, PhD was math. Sort of theoretical computer science, sort of mathematical logic, very abstract kind of logic-oriented computational stuff. But I did all that so that I could go back into sort of understand deep evolutionary questions or even cultural evolutionary kinds of questions. And much of my career has been focused on why we're designed the way we are, why our brains are shaped, they're structured the way they are, why we see in color, why our eyes face forward, why we get pruny fingers, why we see illusions, or in the case of culture, how we came to have writing and speech and music, or back to evolution, natural selection, how we came to have emotional expressions, and what are they a language for? So, those sorts of things. Yeah.
So you already had in mind when you're studying maths and physics that you you are doing this because you're capable, your mind is able to abstract in this way, but your passion was always this sort of cognitive science and cultural science. Is that so? You always were sort of passionate about this?
Yeah, and I think back then I did not have this cultural harness. The cultural stuff refers to say, how is it that we humans, which are biologically apes, how is it that we became the human 2.0, as I call ourselves? Human 1.0s are our biological selves, but we're astronomically more intelligent than the small difference in our brain size compared to the other apes would allow. He's like, well, yeah, okay, we're twice as smart. Some quantitative amount more smart than them based upon the size of our brain relative to our body. But in fact, we're astronomically more intelligent in all of these complex, sophisticated ways. How do you explain that? And this later, which I never thought of when I was a kid, was understanding how cultural evolution evolves over time to tap into evolved capabilities of ours, because we never had time to evolve to have language or speech or writing. So let me just give you a short story here so it doesn't sound
Yeah.
like pie in the sky. Your great grandparents, most of us have great grandparents that were illiterate. It doesn't take very long. If it's not your great grandparents, it's probably your great great grandparents. Literacy and writing is very recent. The oldest versions of it are just several thousand to 5,000 years, depending on which part of the world we're talking about. There was no time to have parts of your brain that evolved to read. It is not something that we evolved. Yet we do it so much all the time, every day. We often read and write, but mostly read much more than we even speak and process speech. So, and we're incredibly good at it. Kids learn very early, despite not being written to, right? I mean, they're being spoken to constantly, even in the womb.
Hmm.
So they're obviously delayed in writing understanding relative to speech understanding, but still they learn really early. So I have this little cartoon in one of my books that shows a kid reading a book about how to somersault, because they're often reading, little children's stories before they're very good at even some very apish behaviors. So how is it that we became so good at reading and we can all do it as if it's an instinct, as if we have a writing instinct? And the reason is that cultural evolution over time shaped writing, shaped the letters to look like something we're already great at processing. And what are our eyes great at processing? Well, they're great at processing just natural scenes, and natural scenes are filled with opaque objects. And opaque objects, are filled, have characteristic features. They have, here's a Y junction here. There's an edge and another edge. There's a Y junction. Up in the corners of this room, there's of course more Y junctions. So, and then you have, my arm behind it. You have a one contour here, and then you've got my arm coming out on one side. You have a T junction. You have certain kinds of junctions happen in conglomerations of opaque objects in the world, and some conglomerations of some kinds of contour conglomerations don't happen, like X's. X's really can't happen unless you have semi-transparent surfaces. So you can actually work out, of all the 36 possible conglomerations of contours with 3 contours in them, some of them are really common in nature. And you can just work it out. Okay, these are really common, and here's how common they are. And these ones are really rare, practically non-existent, and here's how rare they are. And then you could ask, the prediction here is, do we find that writing systems across hundreds of writing systems, the ones that are more common in nature are the ones that are more common in writing? And so this would be a sign that writing systems over time have tried to find the letter shapes that are not easy to write per se. They're driven by what's easy to process, and what's easy to process is that they look like nature. So I call this nature harnessing. Writing systems have culturally evolved to look like nature, harnessing your visual system, the back half of your brain, in turning it into a reading system, even though it was never designed to do that, and giving us a human 2.0 power. That's the kind of storyline.
Wow, that's very clearly explained. So how do you go about, so where do these ideas come from? And how do you go about testing or falsifying, right? So a lot of your ideas, for example, about music, mimicking sounds in nature and helping us coordinate, or how do you go about testing that hypothesis or falsifying it as a scientist?
Well, and I can hint at the music stuff in a minute, but just to stick on this writing system case. So the writing system case was, the main prediction was, if this is the case, there should be peculiar structure in terms of which kinds of contour conglomerations are common in nature. And it's a peculiar combination of these that isn't what you would predict if they were optimized for writing, for example. And so then you can say, okay, it's this peculiar bunch of them, and you can say, okay, let's see if this peculiar pattern is held across human writing systems. And there's other kinds of ways we could test for controls. Is this what you expect by random? Other kinds of null hypotheses that of course we have to test for.
And would you say that this also predicts the languages that are easier to learn as a reader, that those with more common shapes that we represent in nature are those that children can learn to read more quickly, whereas others are not? Or have you not pursued it that far, or is that not a prediction?
That ought to be a prediction. I mean, the way that so we could certainly look at language by writing system by writing system. And you could say that some writing systems have, let's say, it turns out they are hitting more of the more probable ones in nature, and some other one is a little bit harder overall. Let's say, I haven't tried to test that. What I did was, in some sense, I asked them individually, of course, but really what we did was we piled in, here's human writing systems. Let's just pour all these. Here's another. We put them into a big bin and said, in some sense, here's human writing. Does it have the kinds of structures that we find in nature? And often you can't really get the power that you need. There's sometimes these writing systems will have only 14 characters. Sometimes they'll have 60 characters. So it can be difficult to get really great statistics on an individual basis. But across the corpus of human writing systems, across 100 different languages, writing systems, you find this.
Yeah, that's so interesting. See, this is, once I remember when I started following you on Twitter and I saw the fingerprint stuff, I just started clicking and reading and watching, because this sort of thing fascinates me, because I guess the way I see it, and I'd be interested in your view. Do we tell ourselves stories that are very wrong about our human capabilities and functions in society? Do we tell us, no, our eyes look like this because God gave them to us, and he wanted us to read and write? Do you ever find there's a weird tension between the culture and the stories we tell ourselves about human capabilities and the sort of what you had an expression before, the nature first, or you had an expression about these language doesn't come from us, it sort of comes from nature, these shapes, and we sort of decipher it. Do you find much of a conflict there? Do people get upset when you propose these types of hypotheses?
Well, I mean, there's of course sometimes religious folk that can get upset, but often I remind them. I said, look, whether or not you think the designer is God or the mechanism of natural selection, it's really irrelevant. I'm arguing that whatever the result, and of course I think it's natural selection, whatever the result, it's ended up with this particular engineering function. And it's really incredible, and it does it in this particular way, and it's for this particular reason. Here's all the what fors that what it's about. Maybe God did all that. It's not as if I'm going out and showing And here's the astronomically large number of mechanistic events which involve disproportionate numbers of animals dying in horrible ways depending upon their fitness levels. That's not how we test these things. We test these things by looking to see if they have the signature of the engineering design. So maybe it's God. In some sense, it's irrelevant. But other people, much more generally, forgetting about religious or non-religious, practically everybody has the wrong view of human nature. And there's, the one view is that we are kind of blank slates. This is sort of associated with the left. We're blank slates. And what makes us, but both of these wrong views that I'll mention are that we aren't like the animals. And the left associated view, blank slate view, is that we're different from all the other animals in that we are disproportionately plastic. We're universal learning machines. We're not bound and subject to all of these instincts. We can break beyond that, and that's what gives us all these powers. That's not true. We are just as much piles of instincts as every other animal. We are just as much piles of, so that's wrong. The other view is that, okay, we are maybe just as much piles of instincts as other animals, but there is still some special neurons or some special part of our brain or some special things that make us not like the other animals. And that's that special thing, that part of our brain, a special magic, secret sauce that got added evolutionarily, that is what allowed us to go from, twice the size of brains as other apes to astronomically smarter and doing all the crazy things that we do. And that's also wrong. And they're both wrong in this kind of, I consider them sort of, what is it called? Before heliocentric, we had geocentric. They are very homocentric. And so my argument is that, no, you have to be, the heliocentric view is that we are just another animal. It's more of a Galilean view about what human nature is. We are not different. We're not more plastic. We are just as much piled with instincts. And our instincts themselves, of course, every species has its own unique facets that make it that species, but there is no magic sauces that gave us this, this much more intelligence biologically to suddenly, through the roof to the moon, more intelligence. What did it was a relatively small thing. We are social, and over time, we allowed us to start inventing things, and memes would be passed on over time. And as long as we were very smart for long periods of time, but we kept getting, too few of us would get killed off. And so all this sort of clever stuff would get lost. But as long as we started to have large populations that maintain some kind of contiguity, so you can maintain memory of all of these discoveries, so to speak, this technology that we were creating, these ways of talking and ways of doing things with one another that harnessed our ancient instincts, then we could build on that over time. And so the other way before we got writing, we got language, spoken language. And spoken language, I argue in my book, harnessed along with music. But the idea is that just as writing later culturally evolved to look like nature, the sounds of speech culturally evolved to sound like nature, to sound like the kinds of events that solid objects make. Nature is filled for the most part with solid objects. And so you can work out, what are the grammars of solid objects? Well, they hit, and they can hit, and you can slide, which I can't really make a very slidey sound right here. I guess I can maybe just, right? And whether it's hitting or sliding, this thing was ringing. You could tell this wasn't like a stapler. That's not the ring of a stapler. Things ring. And back there, this was ringing a little bit, sounds it, but the wall was ringing more audibly. So you have hits, slides, and rings. Well, if you think about it, what is language built out of? What are the basic phonemes? The phonemes are plosives. P, t, k. That's just hits. And then we've got fricatives. Those are the slides. And then we have all the sonorants for A, E, I, O, U, and then ya, wa. All of these are just the sounds of vibrating things. And the book goes, that's just sort of one out of 30 or 40 different kinds of peculiar grammatical structures that you find in the way that solid object events sound in nature. And then you can say, oh my gosh, across human languages, you find the same morphological in this sense, is just describing how phonemes, how the basic constituents of speech combine in making words. The words are more complex they're not just hits and slides, they're the combinations. You might have a hit, bounce, and that slides, then hits the wall. Let's say that would be a little event. That might be the word baby, so you're gonna hit, and then bing is ringing, and then it hits again, and then, whatever, paper, it would be a fundamentally different, but "bu" and "pu" are also different because they have a different kind of meaning in terms of the hardness or elasticity of the kinds of objects involved. So there's a whole, half a book that's related to, again, the way, the key things, and this is going back to the misconception that people have about what humans are.
Mm.
People will actually say central to being human is language and writing and music, and then you can start listing off, but those are going to be central, right? No, that's not central to being human. If by human you mean it in the way that you're referring to cats and dogs and baboons and all the other things. No, human 1.0, to emphasize our biological selves, didn't have any of that. We didn't have any cultural technology at all. We just were brighter, a bit brighter, quantitatively definitely brighter than chimpanzees. But without this cultural technology, which requires cultural evolution over relatively short periods of time, but still kind of long periods of time, hundreds and thousands of years, up and running, then can harness the soul stuff because we have an unchanging brain. Our brain is still the same as it was, probably 800,000 years ago, a million years ago. It was qualitatively pretty darn similar to what it is now. What makes us different is this cultural technology that got evolved over time, which got to, the way that we speak in language is technology that allows us to suddenly communicate and have language. And that is not a biological capability at all. That is something that came through culture. And so culture is what makes us who we are. There's nothing special about us biologically at all.
Yeah, I think I'm coming around to that view incrementally, ever so slowly. Um, uh, yeah, I the story of uh, what's the boy lost in the Jungle Book, right? Is that so? If the child was lost and raised by the apes, they would have the mind to function in that ape society still, even if physically they weren't as capable. Is that sort of your point, that the mind is not that much different? It's very incrementally different. What separates us is this vast history of culture through trial and error and evolution that is getting passed down as from birth to children. Is that sort of
Right. And none of it's in here. If for some reason, you imagine a bunch of humans were just dropped as babies and ended up being raised by wolves, they'd be
yeah,
out of luck. They would just really have just transported back half a million or a million years
yeah,
to what it was like to be them, what it's like to be a human. And what it's like to be a human in this sense really is not that dissimilar to being a chimpanzee. And I don't mean that they all have each of the apes has their own kind of lifestyle. They're all,
mm,
we had our own lifestyle too, but I just compared to us, it's just
yeah,
going to be another ape lifestyle as far as we're
yeah.
concerned.
So one of the big ideas that I've got from your books and talks and social media feed and your great Substack, Loofwired, is that the emotions and the perception of emotions in others are really core to the function of humans coordinating. And I want to sort of um, get you to expand on that idea. So you've sort of we've gone from the language as this technology that harnesses our biological capabilities to observe the natural world, and then we get into bigger, more complex cultures where we need to resolve conflicts and perceive emotions and express ourselves. How are emotions? Let me ask it as a dumb Aussie bloke. My wife tries to communicate with emotions, and I find it very difficult. But communicating with logic and words that mean their dictionary definition, I find very easy. Can you help me learn this idea about emotions and expressions as a coordinating function in the culture?
Well, look, you might think that you're not good at it, but here's what you have not been doing during this conversation. You haven't been talking like this the entire time, where you give me facts and information, but you put no confidence or humility telling me the extent to which you have confidence in what you're saying, or lack of confidence, or confidence in what I'm saying, like respect versus lack of confidence in what I'm saying, which would be disdain. You're not doing that at all, right? You're that's so we're not statisticians by nature. I'm not going to say you say, you know, Bengal tigers are larger than, let's say African tigers or whatever, some other kind of tiger, or Siberian tigers. And if I say that in a flat affect, and then I say, and the statistical significance is, point less, that's not how humans are going to talk. But I could say Asian, whatever, Indian tigers are definitely bigger than Siberian tigers. Now you know that I'm confident about that claim. And you say,
Mm.
no, that's ridiculous, right? Now you've shown disdain for my thing. And in doing so, whether if I show confidence in myself or disdain in you, what I've done is that I push chips onto the table, right? This is. Let's think about poker. One of the amazing things about poker, and actually, before I even say this, we just talked about the fact that if you dropped a bunch of babies into some other world and they got raised by wolves or whatever, or apes, something like this, they've lost all of their language. They're going to go back to their ape selves. And what is it like? It's almost impossible for us to imagine. This is how I start the book of Expressly Human off. It's almost impossible for us to imagine what it would be like to not have language. And yet every animal, the rest of the entire animal world, is just living its entire life this way. And even we were living our entire lives this way up until 500,000, just very vaguely years ago. Everything that we did was no language whatsoever. How is it even possible? Now, the the way that we, if you've ever been to, let's say, a bazaar in some foreign country, you're trying to haggle for things, you can still figure out ways. And the way that you would do it, you would just be doing lots of mannerisms, emotional expressions, and gestures, and you get by. You can figure it out. But what you're doing there is you're relying on your emotional expressions entirely. But what you slowly realize is that we're relying on our emotional expressions all the time. And let me go back to poker to give you an example. Now, in poker, you can play online, of course, and then you can't be emotionally expressing at all, which is the best example. But even in person, you could choose to have totally flat affect. Some people choose not to. They try to bluster and do, but you could just totally have flat affect. You don't need to have any emotions on the outside to play poker. What's doing the emotional expressing when you're playing poker, it's done in a formal manner by how much chips you're putting in. If you push, and it's a smaller number of dimensions than it is than when we're playing the game of emotional expressions, because I can push in chips because I'm confident, or I can push in chips because I say I'm disdainful towards you. I'm saying you're not confident, or I can pull chips off by being humble, say actually I'm not too sure about that, and or I could say, oh yeah, I think you're right, and so I'm sometimes pulling chips off. If I was, we have more dimensionality in our game, but it's basically a more complicated version of poker. So you can have a bunch of people who disagree, right? I think my cards are better. You think your cards are better. Judy thinks her cards are better. And of course, we can decide to fight. Sometimes you can say, we're going to fight about this. We all show our cards, and turns out one of us is right. But a lot of times, and in nature, you don't want to have to fight about it, because fighting about every last thing hurts, So you want to live and go on to the next day. You'd like to settle out of court, right? And you want to settle out of court, and you do this by, you feeling each other out, and feeling each other out in poker, saying, I'm this confident. And you're like, oh, I'm this confident. And so what do? At some point, I say, I'm out. I fold down. We never saw the truth, but we decided, we agreed, we came to an agreement without seeing the truth, without having to fight about it. And we did this without any language. No one spoke, and no one in this case even emotionally expressed. But the key is those pushing of chips is what emotional expressions are doing. They amount to chip pushing is in it. And these chips are our reputation, social capital. So all the time, all the things that we do are amounting to all of these four, there's really two dimensions. There's I can be proud or very confident or humble, and I can also be respectful towards you, or disdainful. They're me making claims about your confidence, or me making claims about my confidence. So those are the two main dimensions. There's two other dimensions that are also important for understanding it, but that's the key to get it. It's really all about confidence, me and you, in a conversation. And it's done, it's communicated, not because of just some languages. I'm confident. No one would believe that I'm confident if I wasn't staking something. And no one would believe that I think that you're not confident if I wasn't staking something. So I have something to lose. If I show disdain and it turns out you're right, everybody knows I've been humiliated. Or if I show confidence, do you know who I am? And it turns out I'm wrong, then I also lose confidence. All of these things are about how the reputation chips get redistributed, either after someone folds, that is, they just get, okay, I guess you were right, we never figured it out, or we figure out what the true thing is by fighting about it. Fight could be a physical fight, or it could be whatever. We look it up in the dictionary and find out that you were right about which was bigger, Greenland or some others, whatever. Those are the two ways but it's really poker across all of humankind at all times. And even philosophers, they think that let's be very careful. No, if you read philosophy arguments back, they're filled with emotional expressions. They're conveying everything through disdain and contempt and confidence. And it used to be that I thought of language as a bunch of propositions, careful propositions, and a little bit of like emotion icing on top. Now I think it's the other way. It's just emotional expressiveness, confidence, and myself or in you, and or vice versa, and then a little bit of propositions along the top. The propositions really don't matter nearly as much as the emotional expressiveness.
Wow. Yeah, I perceive that now a lot. So I'd say I'm a property economist, and there's a few debates going on. And when we get into the details, I can sense that it shift, like where emotions now coming to dominate. We've done the sort of uh, civil sort of, oh, but you said this and that paper found that and they use that data. And then it gets to a point where it's just emotion, personal attacks, emotion, and then sprinkled on the top of these little stories. This is why I'm like, but that's completely illogical. This is basically a giant page of emotion written down with 10 illogical contradictory statements weaved in. This is clearly an emotional expression, not a logical sort of argument. And it happens in science all the time. So I guess I'd like to
And just to
now,
be clear,
yeah.
I want to just, and it's not because we're having a nice discussion, but again, it's being coordinated by our emotional expressiveness the entire time, right? Because we're not talking in that flat way. I may not be showing disdain for it, but we're most of the time, these emotional expressions are done to coordinate social behavior. But it's done like the two chipmunks in those old things. No, you go first. No, why don't you go first? That's the way we're cooperating at all times. And so they're all often being humble, respectful, humble, respect. We're showing lots of humble humility and respect towards one another because we're having a nice conversation where we're not, we're not at odds, and that's not the nature of this kind of thing. It could somehow become that, but it's just as emotional, and there's just as much staking or refusing to stake. I'm going out of my way to not put you into a position where you might have to stake too much because that's part of the etiquette of the situation, right? So it's still all here, right? And it's regulating the behavior.
Yeah, good point. I feel like this is a little bit of a life lesson here. So I hope the listeners are appreciating this next time you're having a conversation with your spouse or whatever the case is. So, Mark, I wanted to sort of move on to from your vast array of ideas informed by this approach that humans are just not uniquely special, right? We just have this evolved and learnt culture passed down that harnesses our biology. I wanted to ask you, were there any ideas that your early ideas that you were wrong about that you've changed your mind significantly on during the course of your research?
Well, I certainly here's one. I mean, when I was young, I had this is not really a discovery that I've undiscovered or think is wrong so much as my view as a young physics kid, because I was more of a physics kind of watch Carl Sagan, grew up in that generation of being motivated spiritually to be a scientist because of why is there anything at all? These kinds of deep questions, why is there consciousness, which I've never really worked on consciousness, but those sorts of deep questions. But my attitude at the time was that my notion of what a fundamental question was compared to what I think it is now was wrong. I often thought, well, who would want to study anthropology or sociology or even biology? I was thinking maybe I was interested in like how could consciousness happen? That sounded deeper than typical biology. But my attitude towards that has fundamentally changed. A lot of the stuff, the lower you go down, the more the more fragile it in fact is. There's no good reason sometimes for why, there may be 30 something parameters in the standard model that no one can possibly explain. It's unclear whether anybody could possibly explain. But the higher you go, no matter what universe you go to, and even no matter what the laws of physics are, if there's a whole bunch of people, some of the civilization, they're going to be arguing about free markets versus communism, socialism. They are going to be having the same argument. They're going to have, they might have people that see illusions, geometrical, all the illusions that we see, geometrical illusions being one particular case. This is one of my discoveries concerning. This is because your brain is slow. You can't instantaneously, when light hits your eye, create a perception, which means that by the time your perception is created, it's a tenth of a second. Some finite period of time has gone by. So what you want to do is generate a perception not of the way the light was when it hit your eye, or the way the world was when light hit your eye. You want to try to guess the next moment and generate a perception of that. And all of these illusions that we perceive, like when there's two lines, there's a whole radial display, but there's these two vertical lines, but you perceive it like this. That's because it's going to change in that way in the next moment. But my point is, even in some other universe, right? Totally different laws. Standard model doesn't apply, but there are creatures that move forward. If there's creatures that move forward, then they're going to have the same kinds of optic flow dynamics. And as long as their brains aren't instantaneous, and of course they're not instantaneous, they will see the same kinds of illusions that we have. So a lot of the stuff that matters, the higher up you go in the hierarchy of knowledge, which I thought was all fragile and peculiar and arbitrary and kind of just, who would want to study this? Because it's, the universe could have been a gazillion different ways, and that's just what. No, it turns out a lot of the stuff, no matter where you go, you're going to end up with a lot of the same convergent stuff. You're going to have, if there's any kind of planetoid things, if there's water, you're going to have things swimming in it, and they're going to look like sharks or dolphins, convergent evolution, or the, whatever, the ichthyosaurs, which were, you end up with convergent. That's a nice real life case of convergent evolution. But the idea is that even the structures in whatever universe you are, the higher up you go, the more you'll start to see similar kinds of structures. So I've gotten a whole new understanding and feeling for what counts as more universal and in some sense more fundamental and more worth working on. And it need not always be down at the bottom. Sometimes it's really high up, and that's where the universal stuff are.
Wow. Wow, I did not expect that answer, but that's very interesting. And I think I've had a similar journey. I started in high school being a bit of a maths, physics nerd, studied engineering, and then got into economics and realized that, yeah, there are these emergent patterns at higher levels that are also fundamental as well. Do you happen to know, just a quick side note, Gerd Gigerenzer? He's
Yeah,
a
sure.
yeah. He's
Yeah.
very similar, takes a similar approach to economics, that what looks like irrationality from a sort of textbook economic view is an evolved rationality for human beings to function. They're forward looking, they can change their mind later. We don't want to be this sort of one shot, I've got my whole life set today and I've locked it in and committed. You want to,
Right.
we're creatures in an evolving and changing world, so we have adaptations for that, and there's a rationality to it. So I find that's interesting that both you and Gerd have sort of converged on this more evolutionary approach. So how did you know Gerd? Have you worked with him or studied?
When you say no, I know of. I've never met
No.
Gerd.
Oh, okay.
I don't know him. I thought just know of him. But yeah.
Okay.
So I mean,
Sure.
just as a cognitive scientist, he's of course part of that world.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it would occur to me another thing that happens when you're a young physicist. When I was young, I remember my first paper that I wrote. I wrote it so that it had no redundancies in it. It was sort of a mathy paper. Actually, it was on sort of showing that mathematically there are certain kinds of computational problems that some take you, in order to solve it, you may have to have sort of follow. The question is, can you know that you're going to solve it when you do? Are there problems that you're getting near to the solution? And then you can show there are some problems that it's a lot farther. You're not really sure how far you are, but at least you know that it's going to take, let's say, 3 committee meetings, and then in between, then you may have to have one meeting where you decide how many committee meetings you're going to have to solve this problem. But then you can talk about how many committee meetings, or how many meta committee meetings, or how many meta committee meetings. And then it turns out, then you can show that, okay, for all of these, there's problems that are that hard. But then you can show there's still kinds of problems that are beyond all of that hierarchy, which means that no matter how much you try, you'll be surprised when you finish. That's a eureka moment, right? So I was trying to work on the computational mathematics of eureka moments, and showing that there are mathematical problems that are necessarily eureka moments. But of course, a lot of these problems that in principle need not have eureka moments for a particular individual computational machine. You might still get a eureka moment because it's too freaking hard to handle the full set. But that's the guy. But when I wrote it, my point now is I wrote it, it was completely incomprehensible even to me 4 or 5 years later, right? Because you're thinking, your attitude then is like, I'm writing these things that are going to be on God's book, and I don't want any extra words or I want a pure symbology and like this kind of weird stuff that when you're young, you kind of have this romance. And then later I said, this is just dumb. So then I completely changed so that everything that I write was trying to be just as informal and fluid and easy to say, and just not trying to be fancy, but so that you can actually be understood. And
Yeah.
that was kind of a shift as well. And it doesn't take anything away. No, you're just that's and it's hitting those intuitions that often really spread things. You're, oh, now I get it. Without which you just yourself, you're not going to get it, and the audience won't get it.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. For anyone listening, I'll put all the links to Mark's books. They are written, I've read Expressly Human, Motorcycle Mind. They're written very straightforwardly. You're not going to have your mathematics degree to comprehend the point. I appreciate that, Mark, and I think I've also become a lot more like that. That a lot of academia is full of those games, those signaling social status games of make my paper as difficult to comprehend as possible, and it will make me look
Right, right.
smart. And
And I
but
wasn't doing it to make it look, but I just felt like it has to be deserving of being on
yeah.
this ever thing a publication. It's just I don't know some weird aesthetic that you acquire when you're little when you have too much respect for academia or something.
Well, maybe we should talk. I've got that. That was going to be my last question about your career. You had a very successful academic career, and from reading your CV and whatnot online, it seems like in 2010 you jumped ship and became very entrepreneurial instead. What's the story there? Or why aren't you just a regular professor living the dream of so many young, smart, budding academics?
Well, I mean, first, it's never a dream even for the experimentalist. But first of all, I'm a theorist, and as a theorist, I quickly realized. So I was at my first job was at computer science in Ireland at University College Cork, and then I was doing neuroscience in the department at Duke, and then I won a Sloan Sports Fellowship at Caltech. I was there for 4 years, and then I was a professor, assistant professor at cognitive science and at RPI. And at some point, I was like, "You're just chasing grants. They're just, and you have no choice but to chase grants. And in order to chase grants, and as a theorist, I'm a good theorist, and I'm not a good experimentalist. I have to do some kind of experimental stuff for my illusion stuff, but still, those experimentalists are incredibly bright at the kinds of stuff that they do, and I'm good at my theory stuff. But you can't write a grant to get 5 years of research money to do theory. So a lot of times in theory, you're just sitting there with a notebook, and I've got 50 of these notebooks of tiny little writing, and it's all, I mean, 99.9% of it is crap, right? And I'm hoping, just keep hoping there's going to be an idea coming, because maybe there's just never going to be the next idea. So there's not much to write. And so you had to pretend to be an experimentalist to come up with 5 years of it. And I said, this is just not going to work for me. So I decided I need to leave. I need to start my own companies and have a research institute kind of that allows me to build companies and books and other kinds of ways of bringing in income that allow me to buy my intellectual freedom from the grant lobotomizing system. And so that's what I did in 2010. And so I guess it's been 16 years. And I mean, I only had two books. Actually, even after I left, Harness came out. That was my third book. And I've had three more books since then and other publications then. But I've been focusing more on books because not all of my things are grand unifying theories that require a whole book, like why we have color vision. Color vision is an empath sense. The illusion stuff could be done in a smaller, but some of the stuff is a book length argument. Harnessed, how we came to have language and music is a book length argument. The emotional expressions in Expressly Human, really, it's a book length argument. There's just no way around it. You can't get this done in a small paper. So I needed the ability to have long track periods of time to come the Expressly Human book. So it took almost 10 years to come up with, to work out all the details, and then another couple of years just to figure out how to put into a book that's actually comprehensible to me and everybody else. And that wasn't easy. There's no way to do that in academia, to have that kind of freedom and time. And as a theorist, it was crucial. So that's really why I left. But I haven't stopped being an academic. Although then when COVID hit, so I became a different kind. I mean, I would talk in social media about free expression, but I tried to stay apolitical. I thought, okay, there's other people that are, I'm more of a libertarian type. I'm a classical liberal about civil liberties, free expression, and freedom. But then when COVID happened, all of these people that I thought were classical liberals or libertarians and had believed in civil liberties suddenly were demanding lockdowns and were poo-pooing the idea of cost-benefit analyses. And just all of these people completely failed. All of these people that I thought would have been exactly the folks who should understand that civil liberties are for the perceived emergencies. And breaking civil liberties, violating civil liberties are our greatest emergency. All these sorts of things. Almost nobody in March was saying this. And eventually, luckily, one good thing about having sort of a left, an entrenched left and an entrenched right, is that over time, the people on the right who were also demanding lockdowns realized the people on the left were, and so they said, "Oh, well, I don't want to. I want to do if they're not doing," and they switched. So then they became, their own kind of thing, which was actually useful. Because I think this is one good way to sort of fight against mass hysteria as a natural bi-party, it's more than two, but roughly two that moved on their own. So I popped up and said, well, I need to start speaking, and was really slow about it. It took me almost 8 months before I was willing to even do my first science moment. I have a science moment series on YouTube and Rumble and IG. I just felt awkward. I really want to get into the space. It's one thing to type on Twitter. It's another thing to do part of what was going to be more of a science-oriented stuff, my kinds of science. And I said, I just can't keep my mouth shut anymore. So since then, I'd say probably now 3/4 of my stuff on my Science Moment channel, I'm almost 600 episodes in, are often on socio-political issues, but trying to get at complex, emergent, subtle issues or cognitive fallacies that people are making, kinds of things that, from my perspective as the kind of scientist that I am, see everybody making these sorts of mistakes, misunderstanding how to understand socio-political systems, because they think they understand socio-political systems. They think that it's all done by top-down cabal and a puppeteer, and yet that's not how any of these things work. They're all massively complex, emergent, evolved systems, and you can't understand it the way they understand everything else in your life. Anyway, that's just so I became known. I sued the federal government for censorship in the United States federal government. I was the first lawsuit, and Changizi versus Department of HHS. So suddenly I became thrown into this world of socio-political stuff. And now, right now, as an Iranian, my wife Iranian, now in this whole Iran nightmare that's going on. So I became known by more people, I would say, for my being involved in socio-political stuff than even as a scientist. Just sort of accidentally it has happened.
Wow, that's the emotional expression must be working, because the next question I have written here is the emergent nature of things. COVID, you've been outspoken about freedom, and my question was going to be, before you've sort of explained to everyone your story there, what do you think people misunderstand in the context of COVID? And today, there's still a lot of censorship going on. So in Australia, we've just banned social media for under 16s, which has completely failed because technologically there's not really a mechanism for it. But now there's talk here of banning Twitter/X for everybody. It's really quite extreme. And one thing I noted, and people should go and see Mark's X feed, is you've screenshotted all these COVID freedom fighters tweets from early 2020, when they were the ones saying, lockdown, don't be one of those dickheads who goes all around the street, do what you're told, which is hilarious. And as you said, once the right realized the left was pro-lockdown, it actually fought for freedom. It didn't want to be together. So what do we misunderstand about this safety versus liberty, freedom versus censorship and control and conformity, from an evolutionary perspective that sort of informs your view of COVID and your sort of support of liberty?
Well, let me sort of riff on the way that you. So one of the annoying things about I created this list of all of these people that became anti-lockdowners. They became sort of COVID freedom fighters, and it might have not been until April or May or June or a little bit later that year, or sometimes even longer before they did. But some subset of them, not all of them, but some subset of them not only became switched over, and it's great, all things equal, but they began arguing that this was not. So in my view, it was a mass hysteria. This is a collective crowd thinking, a group think And once they got frightened, just like you find like starlings, there's a whole bunch of starlings, and you end up with these amazing formations of, a million birds doing stuff. And humans are very good at this. They go, wow, isn't that beautiful? Look at all those starlings. And someone says, I wonder who's in charge. And they go, what are you, an idiot? There's no one in charge. This is an emergent behavior. It's really complicated to understand. And then you see massive numbers of humans, which are much more complicated than starlings individually, but the massive complexity of all these humans doing these large scale things. And someone says, and someone might say, yeah, actually, but there's no one in charge. It is happening by virtue of these large emergent forces. People just laugh in your face. No, there's a cabal that did this to us. 20 years in the making, starting in 2000 and blah, blah, blah. There was this group, and they decided that in 2020, they were going to do this so that they could have genocide by killing 0.01% of the population with virus, with a vaccine or something, or a great reset, or putting chips on us. And I have like 17 of these theories that I did where I was covering the number of crazy ideas. There's always has to be a cabal, and it's often the Jews, right? So and I want to say this is natural, and this gets back to this is one of the things that one has to understand. Regular life is filled with cabals. Regular criminal life is filled with cabals. Criminal evil is cabals. In fact, the internet is just filled with cabals arguing inside this group and lots of. There are cabals everywhere. There are conspiracies all over the place. There's a trillion conspiracies. What there's not is one conspiracy in charge of all of them. Like the ring that rules them all. They're all competing, and so no one can create the virality where they get their idea to spread and can make the masses doing it. Sometimes it happens. They're like, holy crap, look what happened. This went viral. And it's not the one you wanted to go viral, but something goes viral, but you can't decide and can't design it to happen. But human intuitions, and this is where a lot of scientists don't get this, they have impatience for people who don't believe in natural selection. They have impatience for people who don't understand free markets. They have impatience for people who don't understand free expression. And they all are deeply counterintuitive. Because so you might imagine, like, what's the best way to explain how it is that I have eyes that are so functional? It's not that there was 2 billion years of evolution of all of these things dying and being eaten at disproportionate rates and so on that led to this. That's crazy, man. A god did it, and in fact, that's a pretty good argument. I'm not saying it's actually a good argument, but it's a heck of a lot more intuitive than this first thing that I'm trying to throw out. And the same thing for the free market. That this phone that I'm looking at, which is more powerful than in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide, which was sort of this magic book, that's nothing compared to things we're all holding in our hand, and ours is much smaller, and it doesn't have to say "don't panic" as the first rule on it, right? It comes through no designer. It's by virtue of the distributed, decentralized actions of all of these people, and the same thing is required to actually build a pencil. It was the I pencil, this great essay in the 1960s, that you can't build a pencil without having an entire economy of decentralized and distributed that can make that happen. But that is super counterintuitive. To make a pencil, surely it required a king or a cabal to say, we shall now have pencils. Let's figure out what we need to make pencils and make pencils. And the same thing for truth. And this gets to the censorship. It is a lot more intuitive to imagine that truth comes by virtue of fact checkers or a group of experts, and that for each field you should have experts that are scientists and so forth. And they do their committee and they decide what is the consensus, and that's top down put upon us. And that is a pretty good argument too. These are all good arguments in the sense that they really are convincing. What's not convincing is the actual truth. And convincing people know that the way that you get truth is by virtue of all of these assholes in the having trillions of conversations back and forth in this massive public square, lots of local public squares and interaction, and this massive hierarchical network of crazy with trillions of bad, uncouth words back to one another. And it's through this process where most people are saying false things. There's just misinformation all over the place. In fact, science is filled with false ideas. There's a half-life. So people study the half-life of papers. How many years does it take for this field for the average paper to become untrue? They all become untrue. The question is how long, right? Yeah. Truth is built on the ladder of on the ladder or the prongs. What is it? The ladder says prongs. Anyway, on the
Rails.
steps of a
Yeah.
ladder of
Yeah.
misinformation, right? It is through these stepping over these misinformations that we come to the truth over time. That works the same for science. Science is a big social network, and much more generally for the public square. And so these are really counterintuitive things. You have to be the normal intuitions that we have are beaten out of us as scientists because we spend so many years studying natural selection, understanding these kinds of emergent and evolutionary phenomena. We do this in computer science as well, because a lot of the algorithms that we do are sometimes rely on these things, which give us this emergent structure, and we're surprised. We go, "Oh, that's so great." So we lose. Many scientists completely lose. Like someone like Dawkins will often just sort of make fun of the average person for that's just so crazy. No, the average person is right to be skeptical of all the stuff that we're saying because it's deeply counterintuitive, but it's true. So I try to come at it from these perspectives that we have to try to educate people about how it is that you end up with sociopolitical phenomena like mass hysterias and social manias, and the kinds of a lot of what I talk about is they're not just random stuff that's happening. They end up with very predictable kinds of behaviors at these large scales. They end up with particular kinds of narratives which preserve how reputations were transferred within that system. It works a lot like blockchain. There's a whole kinds of structures that you can show end up in these systems and how virtue signals evolve. These are all what you'd expect for an emergent way, and it's not at all what people think is happening, which they think they're in a committee and say, now our group is going to start saying these things, and no, that's not how any of this happens.
Yeah. No, so so people have this intuition that things were designed because that's what they see. They go and buy a car and they go, well, the Ford Motor Company designed that. A bunch of people and committees, they designed it. And they go to work and they get told what to do because there's a top-down directive. But they're missing the higher level that amongst all those companies and businesses and families and households, there is selection going on, right? So within the unit, so I'm assuming you know David Sloan Wilson or know of him. He's the multi-level selection guy. I literally just wrote an article last week talking about, well, within a firm, you don't want too much competition. You kind of want everyone to agree that what the boss says is right. Otherwise, you're very inefficient arguing about every decision. But between firms, you really want them to disagree about how to make things and what consumers want, so that through the selection of the market, you actually get better outcomes. And I think people have a hard time going from, well, within my business, I would like everyone to do what I say, to what's better for society is to have lots of these businesses, and some are going to fail and some will succeed when they deliver what we want. Just like the stories we tell ourselves, the truths of society will, through the trial and error of the market, rise and persist. So that's sort of my response to that. Does that make sense to you as a sort of economic lens?
Yeah, and it can be as economists know, of course, you can end up with much more structured emergent process things that come out of it. It's not just that the best companies emerge. No, but you sometimes can end up with much like thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is a statistical consequence of large numbers of things but then it becomes super predictable. It's all large scale consequence of just large numbers of these things with very predictable physics. That in fact, there's econophysics is all about understanding economics as a physicist would try to approach it. But people's intuitions about these things, my intuitions are bad too, but at least I understand that one's got to think in those terms to make sense of these things.
Yeah, for sure. If you don't mind, are you all right to stay for another 5 or 10 minutes, Mark?
Yeah,
To
5 or 10 minutes.
finish
Yeah.
your,
Yeah.
because I wanted I wanted to, provide the Australians in the audience some juicy information. I read on your CV you worked with David Walsh at Mona in Tasmania. Uh, what's it called? Mona, I forgot what Mona stands for.
The Museum of New Art.
Yeah. Very famous. I went there a long time ago. How did you get involved at Mona, this Australian icon in Tasmania?
Yeah, I mean, they reached out. This would have been 2016, 10 years ago, and they had uh, uh, Jeffrey Miller and Brian Boyd, who's sort of a historian of art, and then Stephen Pinker and myself. They reached out to us. They wanted to do an exhibition, like a 3 or 6 month exhibition, where each of us would have our own curated wings of the museum to bring in art that was illustrative or representative of our theories on the origin of art. And so mine was bringing in pieces that were showing not about exactly, mine was more about harnessing. So how it is that the kinds of things that we find in art have over time evolved to tap into either perceptual, look like nature, or if there's some amorphous form, they still will often have bodily forms within the abstraction. So these abstractions are often not nearly as abstract as one might think, but often sneaking in some subtle things that we've evolved to find interesting or to have natural reactions to. So understanding art in terms of the kinds of ways that these artists or selection processes through the whole entire art world and the viewers of art have ended up selecting for certain kinds of art on the basis of the extent to which they harness us in a more generalized sense. And so a book on the origin of art came out uh, of that on the basis of David Walsh and our four contributions, sort of a big, thick coffee table book. And so that was great. It went down a couple of times and had to, it was a big project to make that happen. It took a couple of years of work to get it ready.
Look, that's so interesting. It's that there's this sort of science and art being blended, very typical of Mona to do something like that. So anyone who's visiting Tasmania anytime soon, go check it out. The last
Well,
question
sorry, I mean, it's yeah, check out Mona, but our
it's
thing,
not
of
there
course, happened
anymore.
10
Yeah,
years
yeah,
ago.
that was 10 years ago. Um, I, the last thing I wanted to ask, you've talked a little bit about reputation amongst human groups as like tokens on a blockchain. Like we all sort of learn the reputation balances of others through our behaviors. I actually wrote a paper during my PhD. I studied political favoritism and gift exchange and how, you know, the puzzling thing that political donors give small amounts of money, 20,000 here, 30,000, 50,000 here, but the favors they receive are worth millions. And the question for the economist is, why are favors so cheap? Right? Why would you sell $1 million favor as a politician for $30,000? And when half of the donors are donating to the other side of politics as well, so they're not actually advantaging you. And the only resolution to that was that the donations are a signal of creditworthiness. They're not a bribe, they're not an exchange, they're a signal. Hey, I want to participate in the game. Look, I'm just burning money here. If you look after me, my credit's good, I'll look after you in the future. And so I had a little model which was like, people accumulate or decumulate status through their behaviors. And then you came out a little while ago talking about social status is like the blockchain. We all sort of show our reputations to others. Can you expand on how that idea informs your thinking about human societies and behavior?
Yeah. So the to remind ourselves, the reason that there's a blockchain is that in decentralized currency, cryptocurrency or Bitcoin, the whole point of Bitcoin is that we don't want it to just, we don't want our money's records to be in some central bank. And so instead it's decentralized so that it's everywhere and nowhere, so that no one can mess with the records of and so in order to do that, you have to have some very special kind of mathematics that make that kind of decentralized ledger work so that it's sitting on a whole bunch of computers all over the world. And one of those ways is called proof of work, which is so that whatever, I gave Bitcoin to Cameron and he gave some Bitcoin to Judy, and lots of transfers of Bitcoin happened all day, let's say, wherever and then you want to summarize that and add that, okay, here's the new things that happened today in terms of who gave Bitcoin to who. But in gluing this new ledger of what happened today to yesterday's into the whole history of them, you have to do some particular mathematical problem that these people that want to get a little bit of payment to glue it, you have to do this really hard problem that then says, okay, I'm the first person to have solved this really hard computational problem, so therefore I'm going to now glue it to it, and I'm going to be allowed that this gluing is presumed to be correct. And then not only is it hard to do, but it's easy to verify. Everybody can say, "Oh, okay, I get it. You're right. That's right." Now, the reason reputation amongst the social community is also a decentralized currency. There's not some witch doctor that has some records about exactly all the humiliations that happened or all the times that that Doug was being blustery and lost the argument. It's held by the memory of the whole group. So it's inherently a decentralized currency as well. And so the way that it has to work is in blockchain-like ways, so that and a very proof of work kind of analogy for a social community is like the gossip person who says, okay, what happened today was, let's say there were 6 different kinds of fights, and so 6 different people went up or down in reputation. But they'll come up with a really good story that summarizes that based upon the past personality types of those people. So it makes it really easy. Oh yeah, well, Doug's always like that. He's always, blustery. So it fits. So they come up with a really nice gossip. And there are some people that are really good at this. They're the gossipers, and you listen to them because you get up to speed, and it's a really simple story. Maybe sometimes it's bending the truth, but it's okay because it helps make it as something that you can easily remember, and you can say, oh, okay, I get it. And that's added to the blockchain, right? That's added to the social narrative of who did what to who in terms of rising or falling in reputation. So you end up with this, by virtue of it being hard to come up with a good story that summarizes it. That's like proof of work. And it's easy to recognize a good story that fits the previous kinds of personality facts. And so you end up with a kind of social narrative that's extended over time for people that are living there, that kind of understand the things that have happened in this community, that summarizes community and summarize the nature of the reputations of the people in it. And that is exactly what a blockchain is for decentralized currencies. But it has to have that kind of function. It had to emerge that we ended up with these sorts of maintaining something like this. Otherwise, people would just do whatever they wanted. The next day, everybody would forget. This is exactly what it's like in old folks' home. Right? You got the old folks, and everybody's a jerk to everybody because no one remembers what happened yesterday. Right? So we don't want like that. And I think that this is even. I think this even extends to the way that we even remember knowledge. Like a lot of the stories of the great discoveries in science or the great inventions often come along with the personality of the particular scientist who invented it or discovered it. And it'll come up with like the Einstein story is sort of, yes, he was just a poor patent clerk in Germany or whatever, and everybody looked down upon him. But then he sent it, and then it's the story of, it creates this kind of story where he kind of rose out of that. And a lot of the stories that are around great events are about individuals and how their reputation changed, either being humiliated or going up. And so I think even the way that we often record knowledge itself is on the backs of a blockchain like, or a social narrative, or a gossip narrative chain, or something like this is what I call it. That's in some sense memorized, in some sense by virtue of the reputation changes that happened. And upon that is sitting the facts that we kind of also are caring about. But it often comes along with these other stories. I haven't fleshed this out. This is like something that would be nice for a whole book someday to really flesh out. But it's interesting. Once if you've had kids that have grown up and they're 16, 17 years old, yeah, they're snotty little kids, but often they're already like 80% in terms of understanding the culture. They get most of the references. They've absorbed all this stuff way too quickly. There's a lot of stuff. And so my claim is that, the fact that each of these new gluings of the social narrative to the old one are gossips that are really easy to recognize that they work is that it's always selecting for really simple to explain total narratives that make it really easy to absorb. So I think kids know too much too quickly. People will complain that it's the opposite, thing. Like, oh, kids don't know anything these days. No, I think it's the opposite. They know way too much so quickly, and I think it's because these social narratives of this kind that I'm referring to have evolved to be amazingly easy to remember. By their very nature, they have to be, and I think a lot of our knowledge acquisition is riding on the backs of that.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's important, even as scientists and in academia, to have a story that goes with your discovery, or people will ignore it. You have to sell it and appeal to people's emotions, appeal to this gossip channel for gluing your new idea onto the story they already have. It's not automatic that people can just go from one sort of mindset about the world and attach a new abstract idea that looks to be true. It's a process there. I agree. Look,
Yeah, and if
Mark,
you can make it more personal about, I don't know, some kind of
yeah,
humiliation of someone, whatever. I mean, then it's even a better memory. But
Look, I really appreciate your time today, Mark, and I highly recommend everybody jump on your Substack, loofwired.com, LOOF wired. Maybe you could quickly explain your idea of being aloof.
Yeah, I mean, I've always tried to be, as a scientist, I wrote up a lot of advice to students in terms of trying to keep a mindset that allows you more able to come up with new ideas. And there's a whole bunch of stuff like don't build complicated tools for some project that you're working on rather than just doing it by hand the first time. It might be 3 weeks of hard work, but if you build some complicated tool, then the next 6 years or 10 years, you're going to be using that tool to hit more things with, right? But one of the big ones is being aloof. And so for years, I wouldn't, unless I was invited to give a keynote, I wouldn't go to conferences. I never wanted to become part of a conference community. I wanted to remain aloof because you go to conference communities, you're a young man, you see, the older professors who have already done X, Y, and Z, you want to become like them. And you get to know everybody, you want to impress them, and then you get older, and the younger people are like giving you too much respect, and you're like, you love that, right? And so all that stuff is like, I don't want, and then the people in the other field, oh, that's a stupid field. They work on stupid shit. I would never, like, you become really biased to what's important. So I didn't want any of that. I wanted, because when I'm done with an idea, I'm never going to get another cool idea in that field. I need to go someplace else and hope to find another idea. So I always tried to remain aloof. And I remember some friend of mine, he said, yeah, loofs of America unite, So I said, yeah, we should create like a, be aloof, loofs of America unite. So loof wire seemed like a nice idea of this notion of being aloof. And I think being aloof helped me during COVID not fall into I wasn't really trying to, I've always been sociopolitically a bit aloof, I think, but I think it certainly helps stay out of groupthink, stay out of social manias. And the more that one can remain aloof in every respect can be good for you in life.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're like-minded. And during COVID, I was the guy that went on TV and sort of said, we don't have to wait for, a vaccine or vaccinate the children to open up. We should just have been open up and let people adjust their lives if they were concerned and not adjust if they're not. And, I copped a lot of crap for that. But I think because I was more aloof, I didn't have my academic tribe and whatnot. It was actually helpful to maintain that and independence in a way. So I guess you're living proof that keeping that independence and aloofness helps you make sense of the world. So Mark, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners that we've missed? You're on Twitter at Mark Changizi. Your books, where can people find your books? What's the best place?
Oh yeah, if you go to my last name is that funny Changizi. It's Genghis Khan. Is it the way we in Farsi we say Genghis Khan is Changizi. Changizi.com. You can find all my books there and all my research. And at YouTube under Mark Changizi, and at TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, everything is under Mark Changizi. You can find a YouTube Science Moment channel. I'm almost to 600 episodes, and find me online.
I really appreciate your time, Mark. A terrific conversation, and I encourage everyone to check out Mark's work and read some of his books. Thanks so much.
It's a pleasure being here.